Chapter 23 The Graveyard. Kendra passed relentlessly through the icy woodland, the delicate waft of fresh snowfall against her face lending urgency to her march. As they went, she watched as the trail gradually grew ever more indistinct, and with it her sense of looming dread pressed ever nearer on her mind. So consumed was she in her cloud of worry that she nearly ran Caleb over when at last he again came to a halt. Her mouth began to form an inquiry, but it never made it past her lips as she stopped and gaped. Between her fervent search for tracks and the inescapable cloud cover that churned above, Kendra's gaze had been so intently downcast that, in truth, she had not looked up to the skyline for a long time. Still, it was staggering to think that something so enormous could simply appear. Thrusting through the clouds like the hands of some god reaching up to embrace the heavens, stood the citadels. They were massive on such a scale that it was hard for her to comprehend. Back home, the country was mild and full of gentle, rolling hills that Kendra had thought almost mountains. These dwarfed them utterly. To her left was an immense fortress tapering up into a single tower. Its walls were varied and patchy, a quilt woven of 100 different fabrics, reflecting countless architectural sensibilities. Kendra recognized some of them. Each was a distinct style, a sampling of some place and time. On one face she saw the delicate, interlaced archways of old Valerian, a net of interconnected stairs that spun into pristine white marble spires. Yet just to its side was the characteristic angular terracotta shape of the modern-day Yenshi Empire, far away to the east, its walls set with colorful frescoes in smooth, geometric patterns. And past that, the tower turned a glassy black that reflected no light, its surface a bubbling mass that seemed almost to flow like viscous liquid into misshapen fingers that extended into open air, frozen in its ancient gesture. On each protrusion, the citadel was lightly dusted in snow. Away to the right, the storm rose up, high and obscuring. A great dark shape loomed just beyond the veil of swirling gray, a mass of irregular shapes that converged into an uneven pillar, stranger than its twin by far. Kendra squinted, but even with her newly sharpened senses, she could make out little of the mysterious monolith. She was suddenly aware that she was receiving attention from both sides. Maya was smiling knowingly, and Caleb watched her with an expression she could not quite identify. She cleared her throat and tried to wipe the stunned look off her face. "I saw them from far away, but—" Kendra struggled for words of explanation to cover for her flushed cheeks. "I couldn't have imagined anything quite like this," she finished breathlessly. "They're quite a sight to see, and that's no lie," Maya drawled mildly. "Not that I'd know." In spite of herself, Kendra giggled, and for a moment she heard something like a snort. But when she turned back to Caleb, he was looking away. "We have to keep moving," Caleb said, already walking once more. "We're not far off nightfall, and if it snows over the tracks, that'll be the end of any chance of finding her." She was not entirely certain how he could be so sure of the time of day. The light had been dim and unchanging in a way that made the hours pass hazy and unknowable. But she did not doubt him. They went on under the imperious gaze of the citadels until the trees and clouds had swallowed them anew. Kendra could see it now. The gray was fading rapidly to black, and she was beginning to stumble more and more often. The sense of desperation had come creeping back into her, a chill down her spine that set her on edge. The snowfall that had seemed at first so beautiful now felt like a curse, almost as if Moira's every trace was slowly, intractably being erased. She felt almost on the verge of panic when Caleb held up his arm to stop her. "Damn it," he said, resignation and fatigue worn open in his face. "Oh, I'd hope it wouldn't come to this. Why in the hell is that woman so hell-bent on—" He shook his head. "What's wrong?" Kendra asked, brows furrowed in worry. "Did you lose the trail?" Caleb sighed. "No, maybe worse." He beckoned her to come close, his voice low and tight. "Look out there, and stay quiet." She stepped in close to see what he saw, peering through a gap in the branches. It was growing difficult to see anything at all beyond deepening dark and the crooked fingers of the woods, but not far now there was a great sheer surface of white. Snow had piled high and rose out of the relatively even terrain of the woodlands in a wide open area. It was a hill, barren of trees and exposed to the coat of fresh powder that shone silver in what little light there was. Somehow she had not seen it from afar. It was a huge landmark in its own right, but it had been dwarfed by the immensity of the citadels to the point of going unnoticed. All up and down the hill, indistinct outcrops of stone speckled the white void. There was something unsettling about it that she could not quite put her finger on. She scratched her chin, puzzled, before it hit her. "Caleb," she murmured, "why aren't there any trees on that hill? I've walked across half the garden and never so much as seen open ground without anything growing on it. I'd always heard it said that things just insisted on growing here." He nodded solemnly. "Life is tenacious under the sisters' care, but nothing lasts forever. Nothing grows there, because it is a place of death. That is the Hill of the Lost, the graveyard of the garden. Any who wish for the sisters' blessing over their dead come here, and they have since time immemorial. And after the exodus of the Fey peoples, it became the resting place for far more dead than ever before, and all the pain and trauma of the myriad peoples driven to the brink of extinction. That changes a place. What you have to understand, Kendra, is that everything works differently in places of great magic. The laws that govern the world start to bend. Even life and death don't mean as much when there are such powers at work, woven into the land itself. So it is that the spirits of the dead, beings of magic, have more potency here beneath the seat of the sisters' power. Some spirits have simply gotten lost, caught up in the eddies of that nexus of magic like a great whirlpool. Usually those souls are harmless enough. They're just people, not quite here and not quite gone. But others, they cling on to those threads of magic, doing everything they can to hold on. It's an immense exertion of will to impose yourself on life in that way, even if only as a pale echo of what you once were. For whatever reason, those souls won't move on. Not yet. Something drives them to remain here, be it fear, sadness, or rage. They're unpredictable, and that makes them dangerous. Kendra shivered in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. It shouldn't have been surprising after all she'd seen now, but somehow she'd never believed in ghosts. Elves and dwarves and monsters, the creatures of the Fae, those were all beings of flesh and blood, matters of historical record. She'd held artifacts of their make, seen the ruins of their dwellings of old. But spirits and specters, Those she'd always taken for mere stories. "What should we do?" she asked, trying her best not to betray the wrenching nervousness that she felt growing in the pit of her stomach. "To protect ourselves from them, I mean." Maya chuckled, though her heart did not seem in it. "It takes a mage to touch magic, unfortunately. The best thing that folk like us can generally do about ghosts is to stay well away from them." Caleb nodded his agreement, even as a muscle faintly twitched in his jaw. "She's right," he said. "Given that we intend to ignore that particular piece of advice, the best course left to us is to get in and out quickly, and attract as little attention to ourselves as possible." "What about this?" Kendra waved down to where Moira's rapier hung at her side. Even resting her hand near the pommel was somehow disturbing, the pins and needles rolling under her skin. "It's steel, right? I thought iron was unbearable to magical beings." He glanced down at the blade uneasily. "It would be distressing for a spirit to be run through with that blade, certainly. But bear in mind, they're already dead. You might drive one off, but likely not for long. And there's another consideration. Bearing that blade against anyone in the garden, alive or dead, marks you as an outsider. Who knows what it might bring down on you? It would be better by far to run than to risk that." He wore a pinched and nervous expression, and he had been leaning in towards her when he stopped, face suddenly pained. He pulled back. "Use it only as a last resort," he said, distant and serious again. Kendra's insides squirmed as a clammy, unnerved feeling gripped her, but she swallowed and nodded her understanding. This was one place she had no desire to see any closer, but it was far too late for reservations now. "Coward," she berated herself. "Moira needs you and you're falling apart. Pathetic." She composed a smile for them, but it was too wide, and she felt her face pull unnaturally taut into what she knew was a truly terrible rictus. She stopped trying, and let her mouth settle back into a thinly pursed frown. "She can't have gone much further," she finally said. "One way or another, this has to end soon. We'll find her, or... well, we'll find her." As they drew closer to the hill, the markers began to crop up. They were spread sporadically through the icy woods, in no particular pattern, and no two alike. Among them were represented more traditions than she could count, from simple slabs engraved in unrecognizable scripts, to elegantly carved wooden poles, to immaculate stone sculptures. Kendra would have found it spellbinding, had there not been such a pit of anxiety gnawing at her belly. She had a bit of a shock when she turned a corner and found herself face to face with a large horned figure, bestial and imposing, his jaw set in a look of stern command. It was only after falling back into a snowdrift with a yelp that she realized he was unmoving and faintly translucent. He appeared to be cut entirely from gemstones, different colors set into each other to form a remarkably lifelike simulacrum. But this figure was perfectly still, its shoulders and head dusted heavily with snow. Maya got her to her feet with a small, reassuring smile. "A Minotaur cursed him," she murmured, her voice hushed and almost reverent. "This must have been a great hero of their people, once upon a time." As they went on, they began to see standing stones, worn down with age, but still solid and tall. At times they had to clamber over the peculiar terrain, severe and angular. "Was there something here before?" Kendra asked as they made their way over the ice-slick surface of a particularly blocky obstruction. "This place feels like a ruin, like something was built here long ago." Caleb nodded, a spark of excitement in the gesture. "It's a subject of some scholarly debate," he replied eagerly. "There's no historical record of it in Elvish libraries, which either suggests that it was made by the sisters for their own purposes, or it predates them. Both are fairly unlikely, since the prehistoric civilizations in this area rarely left behind anything of this scale, but we've also never seen any creation of the sisters fall into such disrepair. Some suggest that—" He caught himself, and flushed, looking away. "It's a mystery, anyhow," he muttered, his voice somber and removed. For a few golden moments, Kendra had felt alight with a reciprocal curiosity. Then it was gone, and she sighed. As they went on, she sidled up alongside him. "You know," she said in a soft undertone, "you don't have to be so—" She trailed off. What? Guilty? Upset? Scared? "It's okay," she finished eventually, but without much conviction. He turned to regard her, and Kendra almost stepped back from that look. In that moment he seemed utterly agonized, something in his dull red eyes close to breaking. Then he turned away, returning to the fading trail. "No, it's not okay, but there isn't time to worry about it now." He walked on with gallows resolve, and did not look back. The landscape was increasingly severe as they approached the hill, the ancient rubble sloping up, rough and jagged, sharp rocks covered in the barest blanket of frost. There were still graves and memorials tucked away in unexpected niches and corners between the strewn standing stones. Still, the trail wound on, high and relentless, a stumbling trek up to the hilltop. "This hill is just a heap of rubble," Maya said. "It's so full of cavities and empty space, I can hear our steps echoing for half a mile." Kendra could pay the words no mind. Her heart was pounding hard now. From the vantage at the top of the hill, there was nowhere Moira could hide from them. She was hurrying now, her climb half a run, as she felt rather than saw the sun slipping away. Slick ice gave way under her feet, and she fell hard, her knee striking against stone with a wet impact. She felt hot blood running down her shin, but paid it no heed. At the edge of her attention, she noticed those long ears perking up as she reached out with her senses. She would have found it unnerving yesterday, but not now, not here. Moira was close. She had to be. They arrived upon the crest of the hill with night on their heels, finding their way as much by touch as by sight. It was a lonely summit over the canopy of the woodland, a barren and jagged expanse. The wind fell mercilessly on that peak, snow flying in her eyes on cruel, sharp gusts. But even so, as she turned her gaze along each slope of the Hill of the Lost, she grew more and more certain. They were utterly alone. No standing figure rose up against the white of the snow in any direction. "I don't see her," Kendra cried, her cool resolve slipping. "Where is—" Maya laid her hand on Kendra's arm, and she stopped short and looked down. Caleb was crouched low, a few paces away in the crook of a few large standing stones. Between them was what looked like a hole in the world. She felt a tingling of black premonition, fear numbing her body worse by far than the cold, as she looked into absolute darkness. Tentatively, she approached the opening, but try as she might, she could not see more than a few paces ahead of her. All she knew for certain was that it went down. "I can feel it," Maya said, and Kendra was surprised to hear a distinct unease in her voice. "It goes down on a steep incline for a long ways, and branches out into tunnels. It's a veritable warren down there, a mess of echoes and twisting passages. There's no telling how far it runs, or how deep." She clenched her jaw hard on the chatter of her teeth. "She went down there?" The question was directed to Caleb, who had finally stood from his tracker's crouch. He nodded, mouth a grim line. Primordial dread lay on her as she looked into the abyss. Any taste for adventure and discovery was gone from her in that moment. Just then she would have given anything to be home in her library, warm by the hearth, the kettle on for tea. The sisters and the terror of the garden would have stayed a story, to be closed and put aside at a whim. "You can't just turn your back on this," Kendra seethed to herself, fear matched now with a rising disgust. "Useless, weak, pathetic. You'll just give up on Moira now? How can you be so selfish? How many people do you have to hurt before you stop?" There was a spark of clarity, as suddenly Kendra recognized this moment. She'd been here once before, on the night she'd left home. She'd rested her hand on her old reading armchair, set to catch the best light by the window, and her resolve had wavered. She had almost turned back. In another day, the caravan would have been gone, the chance missed. But then she remembered the pain in her aunt's eyes, the agony that had screamed out at her every day for 12 years, every time those blue eyes fell across her face and saw her mother, Iris's sister, gone up in flames. And so Kendra had left that house for the last time, and made her way down to the village where the caravan had stopped for one more night. She plunged into the unknown, because there could be no horror out there worse than what she visited on her aunt every morning. In the faraway present, she rose. "Well, that's where we're going. She's waiting for me." A ragged and terrible half-smile of resolve on her lips, Kendra stepped into the void. It was more akin to a stairway than a path, rough-hewn stone descending severely into the maw of the hill. The footing was treacherous and just barely visible, and more than once Maya's hand on her shoulder kept her from tumbling into the indeterminate depths of the blackness. It was a cold beyond any she had known. There was no snow underfoot, but that shaft had the sense of a place that hated sunlight, rejected it with a will. Kendra began to descend faster, heedless of the risk, trying to outdistance the creeping dread that caught at her like fleshless fingers. Passages split off here and there in twisting crevices, but Kendra fell relentlessly down her course, plunging ever deeper. She was not certain how far she had descended, when suddenly her step came up short. It had bottomed out into an open space, the dimensions obscured in the gloom. She squinted nervously into the impenetrable dark, any hope of finding Moira in such a place shrinking and remote. Then, quite unexpectedly, something caught her eye. There was a faint glow, indirect and reflected off a crumbling wall. It was dim but unmistakable, a little light that passed between a crack in the nearby stonework. Kendra found herself pulling urgently at that corner, her heart pounding in her ears as she tried to widen the seam in the rocks. She was vaguely aware of Maya's voice at her shoulder, calling words of caution to her, but it was distant and insubstantial. Everything was. The bitterness of the cold, the screaming of her muscles, it was all nothing against her pressing need. And with agonizing slowness, the stone gave way, the block pulling back with her, spilling weak light beyond into the passageway. There, tucked into that hidden alcove, was Moira. She was not fully as Kendra remembered. The neat clothes that she had worn when last Kendra had seen her were torn and stained. The caravan mistress was thinner, hair a tangled mess, the easy command she had always exuded now gone. Moira cowered, her hands held to her face, covering her features, but nonetheless she had the look of one having passed through a nightmare. She did not look up, huddling against the rough wall. Even so, Kendra felt her heart leap, tears rolling down her cheeks. The weight that had hung around her neck, the guilt of what she had brought upon the woman who had taken her when no one else would have, was suddenly lifted. Moira was pale and gaunt and terrified half to death, but she was here, alive. It could still be all right. She could fix this. Kendra took a step forward, but a hand on her shoulder stopped her. She tried to brush it off, scarcely a consideration, but it held firm. She turned, with a rebuke ready in her throat, but it never came. Caleb stood close, and his eyes, almost devoid of that fiery red, were as melancholic as ever she'd seen them. A thought crossed her mind, and she stopped, heart frozen. The Hill of the Lost. Icy fear running through to her core, she examined Moira with growing dismay. There was no clear source of light in that stony cavity. It almost seemed to be coming from Moira herself, or perhaps through her. As Kendra looked closer, she saw the rough texture of the stone beneath the woman, as though through a murky pool of water. The despair began to break over her in crushing waves as she watched Moira, who was Moira no more. The phantom hardly moved, still hiding her face, but a familiar voice came seemingly from far away, an echo over a glassy lake. "Why are you here?" Tears were burning hot on her face now, and Kendra shook uncontrollably, her mind in a numbing fog. "I'm sorry," she managed, her throat contracting painfully. "I didn't mean for you to. I tried to. I'm sorry, Moira seemed hardly to notice the stammering apology. The words formed with a terrible effort, each coming faint and weak. "Not supposed to be here. What she wanted. Go. You have to go." Kendra tried to swallow, uncomprehending. "She? Who is she?" "Go." Moira's voice came, still distant, but urgent. Her fingers clenched against her face, something spilling between them like black mist. "She wanted you to come. You can't stop her. No one can. Don't let her catch you." From far above, there was a deafening boom. It came like an earthquake, sending dust falling ominously out of the rough-shod ceiling. Kendra looked back up the great shaft, even as stones the size of fists began to cascade down its steep slope like a swarm of locusts. The stormy sky beyond had been luminous with lightning, but even as the strike faded, she could clearly see a figure silhouetted at the mouth of the cave. It was looking down on them from the hilltop, and even at this distance, beyond the tumult of sound and movement, she could see it was in the throes of a twitching spasm. Its arms spread wide at the entrance, shaking and taut with exertion, when a second explosion came, and the entrance was rent asunder. Amid the avalanche of falling masonry that rushed down at her, she saw a glint of red hair and a smile like death itself.